This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
My background is in textile design. I will willingly admit to not being a historian, but I'm very much involved in the kind of commercial practice of the design industry. Part of our contextualization of what we're doing within the university and with the students is we look at objects and look at how they are not only parts of material culture but also parts of design culture, and that's kind of led me over a number of years to be very curious about what actually happens at the end of the design process and what we could call the post-consumption phase of a garment or of an object. So this kind of post-consumption life of the object and the ways in which designed artefacts become historically or socially important artefacts kind of form the basis of my research project. So in this presentation I'm looking at a case study examining the emotional and historical and biographical resonance of two 19th century artefacts for one of the interviewees, their owner, a lady called Norma, as their experience is both historical and lived with objects. So these objects are drawn from the larger research project, which explores the phenomenon of textiles kept beyond their useful life cycle for their emotional and family historical value. So the ways in which socially significant textiles are retained and stored and kind of kept within the home, but can be at the same time quite historically and biographically interesting. These textiles come together to form what are almost like informal archives. So they're not really collections, they're objects which are they can be read as an archive because they're like historical documents that document the different points in someone's lives. And within the family, they're quite private, they're not something that people really talk about. But I find that most people, when you discuss this, will say, oh, I've kept something. I tend to find that a lot of men keep clothing, whereas a lot of women keep things that are related to children or their mothers or other female relatives. But it does seem to be that there's a real need to document our histories through material artefacts as well as through other more conventional means such as family photography. So I was looking into research how an individual's sense of identity can be enhanced by the objects which surrounds them, and how the connection between the material and the affective domain can work in relation to an artefact. So for what I've found is that the textile surface, its form and its function are really key to understanding its emotional resonance for an individual. The emotional response to textiles is not dependent upon the materiality, but it can often contribute and be interlinked. So one of the very interesting kind of routes that I've taken is looking at how objects are kept within museums and how they're kept for public display, because it's almost like the mirror aspect of what I'm looking at, which is a very private phenomenon of objects being kept within the home. And it seems that in many ways objects can really orientate the lives and expectations of individuals, and they can be a really interesting way of showing how social values are disseminated, how relationships are formed, how people relate to both a sense of themselves, a sense of their own identity, and a sense of the identity of the different individuals in their family, and how a lot of these emotions are very tacit, and you have to find ways of really uncovering what the nature of the emotions are with the person. So I was looking at how affective domains can relate to larger historical and socially significant events, or very small private moments. And the artifacts that I've got here, there's kind of two in the case study, really do interlink with all of these different domains. I feel that as clothing and textiles are universal objects, they warrant particular attention within the field of material culture, as through their direct contact with our skin, they're amongst our most intimate of objects. So we've already seen examples of that lovely sheet and this idea of it kind of wrapping and being used within the process of laying out. We're swaddled within the folds of textiles right from birth. People are buried in textiles, and it's one of the only artefacts that's completely universal and across different cultures. So existing kind of dominant methods of research in textile design tend to look at design as a facet of culture, the symbolism of textiles from a semantic or semiotic point of view, psychoanalytical approaches to textiles as well, so what the kind of hidden means of dealing with them are. But really what I was interested in was methods that explore the materiality and history of the object through its experience by an individual. So although these established methods, which include anthropological, ethnographic, object-based approaches, are they're wonderful methods for research, what I'm specifically looking at is the individual's interaction with the artefacts and how the materiality of it is experienced alongside its kind of social and biographical resonance. So I've set the research within a phenomenological paradigm, so looking at a responsive and sensitive approach to research contexts as they are, because you're sometimes dealing with very sensitive emotions. And also what I found is that when I was trying to explore ideas, a lot of the time people weren't fully aware, fully cognizant of what it was that was kind of special to say, oh, I don't know about this and I'm not sure about this. And actually through using a type of phenomenological interview called an interpretative phenomenological analysis, I was able to kind of pick out bits of the interview and kind of reassemble little bits of stories and kind of see what the kind of the resonance was for the individual. So as the anthropologist Christopher Tilley notes, materiality is an integral dimension of culture, and there are dimensions of social existence that cannot be fully understood without it. In particular, I would argue that the emotional and sentimental aspects of social existence can be particularly explored in relation to artefacts and in relation to textiles as they kind of follow people throughout their lives. So really the kind of intersections of the project were between kind of textiles, phenomenology and material culture, as phenomenological methods are established as enabling a fresh, complex, rich description of a phenomenon as it's concretely lived, so as a kind of living experience, which is very much what I'm looking at. The image in this slide is of a Victorian christening gown, which belongs to my oldest interviewee, Norma, who's 87. Norma is very strongly attached to the gown for both its material qualities and its role as a piece of her personal biography and family history. So these are things she was very explicit in kind of describing, that how it relates to her family and some of the themes that came out of the interview were very, very much about her having this gown and passing it on to not only her children but also to her grandchildren, and that was very important for Norma. But what was really interesting as well, which she only mentioned kind of in passing, but the understanding of the craftsmanship of the artifact was really important, and her knowledge as a craftsperson were really important to understanding it, because there was a link between the garment and her own experience as a young woman, which I'll go into in a minute. So this is a Victorian christening gown. It was made in 1865 for a lady called Miss Henrietta Byrd, by Miss Byrd's French mother, and it was bequeathed to Norma by Miss Byrd herself. I've got a little detail of the bodice. The details of how Norma came to know the owner of the christening gown are actually provide a nice little snapshot of an example of social history and a way that times have changed. Miss Byrd was an elderly lady whom Norma's mother-in-law used to nurse in her home, and she described two old ladies that her mother-in-law used to nurse when she first started dating her soon-to-be husband, as Miss Byrd, who was a former headmistress, and another lady whose former profession, she was blind and she'd been trained as a masseuse, so she always called her Miss Salt, the blind masseuse, which I thought was a lovely little detail. So this lady gifted Norma with artifacts from her own kind of sentimental textiles, and what seems to be a way of passing down her own family history through Norma, as she didn't have any of her own children to pass them along to. This kind of social significance has been subsequently reinforced through its uses of key family memento at various different points within Norma's personal history. So at least two, she couldn't remember exactly how many children had gone through because she had quite a few children, at least two of her own children and at least two of her grandchildren. So through inheriting the textiles with their kind of social story and understanding that the lady, Miss Byrd's mother, who was French, made this gown for her and her and Miss Byrd's sister to wear. She added to this kind of social cachet with her own consumption and archiving of the artifacts. What was really interesting is all the people that I interviewed, they had very informal ways, quite frighteningly informal ways of storing these amazing textiles. They'd kind of shoved into drawers. But when you actually examined them, the ways that they were storing these textiles was actually incredibly appropriate to what the textiles were. They were kept dry, they were kept clean. These objects were often beautifully preserved. They looked like they were museum pieces, even though they were, in some cases, 150 up to 200 years old. So they'd taken great care, even though it seemed quite informal. So you can see the creases that are in the garment, and you can see the way that it's been kind of folded down the middle. And yeah, it looks like it had just been made. It was beautiful in terms of its quality. So in the interview, I've got a little extract which Norma describes her acquisition of the gown. This belonged to Miss Henrietta Byrd, who was one of the old ladies whom my mother-in-law looked after. And she was a headmistress or an ex-headmistress, and her mother was French. And her mother made this for her and her sister, and they were both baptised in it. And it's Richelieu work. This is very important. And somewhere I did paint from the photograph a watercolour, and I don't know where that is. But it's, as I say, I inherited this from Miss Byrd when she died. So she was intended to have this object and to carry it on. And she had almost like an informal agreement that she would baptise her firstborn when that occasion arose. We never knew how old she was. She was very old, very, very headmistressy. And she wouldn't tell anyone her age, but she would be 90. When she gave it to me, she'd be 90-ish in 1955 when Christine was baptised in it. And so it could be back 90 from 55, so that's quite old. Yes, so it's got some connections, I think. I know James wasn't baptised in it, but definitely Christine was, possibly David, and maybe Susan. I know that it's always been there. And this was a key kind of point for these textiles. They just, even if they haven't seen them, some of these objects hadn't been unearthed or taken out of the packaging for 20 years. It's the sense that they're there and that there's something very special about just knowing where they are. One of my interviewees, she said, I was filling out your survey in which I was asking them, what objects do you have? And I was thinking, there. I've got a little snapshot in my head of where everything is. So they were even though these things seemed very informal, they were clearly very important, and they had little maps in their heads of where exactly the objects were within the house. I know it's always been there, and I knew where it was, but sometimes they didn't want to wear it. And that kind of confused me at first. I thought, well, of course they wouldn't. They're babies. How would they know? And she said, well, the mother, the daughter-in-law, not particularly. So one of my grandchildren, our eldest grandson, was baptised in it. I don't think his mother really wanted him to be, ha ha ha. But she did. And that was a really interesting kind of point. So it seemed that this was a real locus for her control as well, over not only her daughters, but her daughters-in-law. That she'd somehow coerced this poor woman into having this family gown which had no association to her for being used for her own son, even though she wasn't particularly keen on it. And it's funny because after, when I was analysing the interview, I hadn't really picked up on that at the time. But every time I listened to the interview, I heard this evil little giggle where she went, ha ha ha, she did. And that really kind of, she probably wasn't even aware that she was doing it, because she was very polite, very proper, lovely kind of lady who'd been a teacher, and that kind of hadn't come out. But that was a really interesting facet of her interview. And also the memory and the kind of sense of the family and her control of the family as it arose. So persuading her daughter-in-law to dress the grandson in the gown for his baptism really seemed to enable Norma to consolidate her memory of the gown as being kind of related to her family and representing a sense of who she felt her family were. She further imprinted the memory of the occasion through completing a watercolour painting of her grandson Ben in the christening gown in the photograph. And she remembers the days, particularly when I asked her, do you have a particular memory associated with this piece? She said, well, not particularly, but then she kind of, the thing that really remembered was this poor woman whose grandson, her son, Norma's grandson, was baptised. That was the kind of the key memory. So I did kind of wonder whether there's a little bit of the control as well, was kind of a facet of that, and the fact that she'd persuaded the woman to use it. but she said, in her quote, she said, "Well, I particularly remember Ben being in it, and I think that is there because there was a photograph of him in it, and that I also painted this picture from the photograph." So it's imprinted in different ways. So she's referring to the different ways in which her memory is augmented. And we went down as a family. My husband's brother was the vicar of Holy Trinity in Fulham, and so we all went down to London. He was from the Midlands. And it was a big family party, and I remember all of the baptisms, that one more than anything. That was a big family party, and it was a big, lovely occasion. And then we had a big family get-together for lunch in London afterwards. Also kind of key to her understanding and her kind of appreciation of the gown was a sense of the qualities of the craftsmanship and the materiality. So she said, "Well, I just think it's amazing that somebody could make that," when I asked her how she felt about the garment. And I would have to agree. I mean, I don't know when you would have to start a piece of hand embroidery like this, but I imagine it would take months and months. So it's interesting that it must have been produced during the period of pregnancy, or even possibly before that, in order to have it completed in time for the baby to be baptised, as was the tradition, on the first Sunday after birth. So that was a really interesting little piece. She also drew a link between the type of embroidery in the gown and a piece of her own embroidery. Now, I apologise, this is obviously mid-20th century, but she was very keen that the craftsmanship of the Richelieu work in the original gown should be commented on and appreciated by me. So she actually pulled out a piece of her own Richelieu work, and she proceeded to show me how the work is produced. So it's basically a buttonhole stitch, a running stitch around the motifs, a buttonhole stitch, and then you cut out the internal bits. So she said, "I found a piece of my Richelieu work which I never finished, and when I think of that being made, it's quite amazing really. All the fine stitching and everything, even all the different seams inside." So she's really appreciative of both the material qualities of it and the kind of social qualities. And she drew a very strong link between this piece and her own piece of Richelieu work. And it was quite interesting to hear from this kind of point of departure the links between this sense of this artifact representing its period, representing the lady who she'd inherited it through her own family associations. And then it really moved into a sense of her own identity, because she was talking about this sense of embroidery and how she'd spent months and months embroidering. When she was 20 years old, she was struck down with rheumatic fever. She had to recover for 9 months in her sitting room by the fire, and she describes that period of time as endless embroidery and endless knitting. That's all she was given to do, and that's all she was capable of doing. And so this piece actually was really important, and again it's something she kind of referred to at the time, and it was only through piecing together bits of the interview that the importance of the story came out. Of all the things in her collection, including that beautiful kind of Victorian gown and the objects I'm going to show you in a minute, this little scrap of embroidery was the most important to her. And the reason for that was because it represented the point at which she stopped having this horrible illness, and she was literally set up in the living room next to the fire, couldn't make it up to the stairs, so she was lying in a kind of sofa bed in the living room for 9 months. Because it's unfinished, so that kind of represents the point at which she got better. So I thought it was really lovely that she never really talked about this with her children or anyone in the family, but that the provenance of that piece really did need to kind of go with that, and that she could, it was nice to be able to formally record that, but it would be good if there were ways of doing that for other similar artefacts. So, with the next piece, though there are fewer emotional resonance with the piece, it does richly embody a piece of English history and provides a link between the historical artefact, Norma's father, and Nottinghamshire's heritage. So, as I've said before, I willingly admit to not being a historian by profession. So I'm not certain how typical the route of acquisition is, but it does seem to be very typical of textile artefacts, which are generally passed down along family lines. It's actually a piece of Lord Byron's bedspread, and she had it tucked into a handbag in a wardrobe. Typically, textiles are given as gifts from mothers to daughters, and in the absence of daughters, mothers-in-law to daughters-in-law. So if a woman doesn't have any children as sons, she'll see which daughter-in-law is most appreciative of her textiles, and there seems to be like a series, almost like an introduction. So a lot of these textiles will be given before the old lady dies. It will be, given and kind of introduced with a story, and here's something I made, and here's to really kind of pass along the provenance of those pieces. This piece was slightly unusual in that it came via Norma's father. So it's a less common acquisition route. So Norma describes her acquisition of the piece in her own words. For those of you who are historians, I apologise for the kind of pell-mell approach in terms of how she achieved and acquired the piece, because it's a little bit horrific in terms of plundering the country's heritage. Well, my father was a water inspector, and he was in Nottinghamshire, and there was a place in Nottinghamshire called Felly Priory. And Felly Priory was associated with Newstead Abbey. And Chaworth Musters used to be at Felly Priory, and my father and he had a nice association. My father used to go to Felly Priory, and he had to go and check the water or something like that, and he knew Colonel Chaworth Musters, and he used to give him pheasants and all sorts of little things from the estate. He gave him a little brass bell and all sorts of bits and bobs. And then one day he gave him this, and he said they'd been taking down the four-poster bed or something and disassembling it, and they were cutting up pieces of the bedspread, and he said this belonged to Lord Byron, and would my father like a piece? And he gave it to my father, and my mother's kept it all that time, so we know that in this handbag there was always this material from Lord Byron's bedspread. Okay. So I was somewhat staggered, and it was really interesting in terms of the range of objects that I was shown. I did see a few Victorian christening gowns. This was probably the most historically interesting piece, and then straight through at the other end of the spectrum, a woman had kept a little bit of muslin rag that her husband used to suck on when he was a baby, and there was like literally, you can still see the stains, it's quite gross, but there was literally, that was the kind of spread and the gamut of the different materials. What was interesting is that Norma acknowledges that her daughter has, in her own words, her eye on this. So I don't know whether the piece is actually a piece of Lord Byron's bedspread, because this has come through obviously Norma's word. It may be that there are many pieces of the bedspread in private ownership across the world. I can imagine it almost being like pieces of medieval pieces of the True Cross, in which if you aggregated the pieces you could cover an area the size of a football pitch. But it certainly seems, certainly as her father knew Chaworth Musters, and there was the association to Newstead and Felly Priory, that this is a possibility. However, this does really show the kind of the links between the material artefact, the periods of history, the location, a famous historical figure, and personal family memories, and the way in which a very small little memory or a very small little artefact can link in so many different ways to the context of history and to the context of tiny little private bits of memory. So this was lovely in terms of the way it linked her father's sense of, what he'd done for a living, it conjured up little images of her father going out and about, visiting, inspecting places, plundering the stately homes for little bits of goods, people giving things away, and a very kind of informal, kind of mid-20th century approach to personal heritage and national heritage.